thank you very much for being here. We are here to discuss a very important and burning topic, if I may say so. It's the idea of how we can preserve and conserve groundwater through legislation in India today. I have with me eminent people from the government as well as from civil society. We have Dr. Amarjit Singh, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Water Resources, Ganga Rejuvenation and River Development. Welcome, sir, to this discussion. We have Ms. Malini Shankar, Additional Chief Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Government of Maharashtra, one of the anchor states that has taken forward the groundwater legislation. So thank you very much for being here. We have Dr. M.S. Vani, Trustee, Director, Natural Resources and Governance Program at Development Center for Alternative Policies. Welcome, ma'am. You've done a lot of pioneering work, and we'd like to hear from you on exactly what we need to do to move the agenda forward. I have the privilege of moderating this discussion. I am Jayamala Subramaniam. I'm the CEO of Arghyam. We are a grant-making organization focused in water and sanitation, and particularly interested in preserving groundwater. So thank you very much again. So I just want to paint a little bit of a picture, not that we need to get into too much detail, but just to sort of lay the background here. India is a groundwater civilization. We are the largest users of groundwater by a mile, I think bigger than US and China put together by some estimates. And the dependence on groundwater is huge, 65% overall. I think 85+% for rural drinking water, 65 to 70% for agriculture, and perhaps 49 to 50% for urban drinking water. So that's huge dependence. At the same time, what we see on the ground today is that there is an issue of quantity and quality depletion, which is making 60% of our districts vulnerable in some form or the other. So really, it's a huge crisis on hand with us, in front of us. The added complexity in groundwater is that it is an invisible resource. So data in terms of understanding exactly how much is there and what can be used and in what form can it be used, the science of it, it really requires a lot more investment to make it demystify it and make it transparent. Also, the nature of the resource makes it a common pool resource, but its treatment has been in the nature of it being a private property resource. So some dichotomies that emerge from that. On the ground, we feel that there's huge dependence on groundwater, but for very, very, it's a large number of users that have very small sort of plots of land, which they then have to depend on groundwater for. So there is millions of users who have a stake in actually preserving the groundwater. And since it's a complex issue, it requires time to act in a meaningful manner, but the cost of inaction seems to be unfairly borne perhaps by the resource poor. So in some sense, that sort of triggers, inaction triggers perhaps more inequity, and that's something that we want to discuss here, that there perhaps seems to be a need for doing a lot of things along various lines to deal with this crisis, but here we are here to discuss what is the role of legislation in actually creating sustainable and equitable, to preserve the resource of groundwater sustainably and equitably. What is the role of legislation? Tracing a quick history, I think you probably luminaries in this field, but I believe the work started in 1970, and then the Model Groundwater Bill has seen some variations across time. And the adoption by states perhaps has at best been inconsistent, and perhaps Maharashtra has been a leader in this field, and we are Malini from, so we'd like to hear from you. If I may just start with this question of, is having legislation a sufficient condition, or is it a sufficient and necessary condition? What would you, Dr. Singh, if I may start with you, what would you say is perhaps the answer here? What is the role of legislation in groundwater?
I think you have to understand 2 or 3 basic things before we discuss this issue. The first thing is that there is a huge draw of groundwater. We are one of the largest drawers. We draw more groundwater every year than China and US put together. So that's one thing which needs to be kept in context. So there is a rapid decline in groundwater in a number of places. We survey about 6,000 blocks every year through the Central Groundwater Board and with the states, and we find that almost 1,071 blocks are overexploited, which means the draw every year is more than the recharge of those aquifers down below. almost 4% are critical, means 90 to 100%, and 68% are safe. The remaining are between 70 to 100%. So overall, the picture that emerges is we draw a huge amount of groundwater. It does a major service for economy, as you rightly said, 65% irrigation, 85% drinking water needs, and it has contributed a great deal. But that being so, you have to remember that there are huge now economic challenges. The water is being depleted, it is contaminated at a number of places. There is an ingress of seawater, salinity in a number of places, and there is problem of arsenic in a number of places which we have to take care of. The two other factors which you need to keep in mind is that the structures for regulation, the institutional mechanisms for regulation are extremely weak at the moment. We need to strengthen them, pep them up. Some of the states like Maharashtra have done some good work, but overall these structures are pretty weak. Overall, the picture that emerges is that it's a hugely unprecedented scale of drawal, which is increasing by geometrical progression in all zones, north, west and south, but not in the east where we have the maximum amount of water. There somehow, because of people's inability to buy diesel or inability of the states to provide electricity, the drawal has not been so much. It's in the range of 30 to 37%, as against 62% on an average. So you have to keep these five things in the mind, and I think we need to create a huge amount of awareness amongst the people that we are creating, using the groundwater in a very, very unsustainable manner, and we need to fix it. If we have to protect the interests of the future generations as against our own interest, we'll have to take care of that. And I think there the legislation would be, I would give the first priority to people's awareness, empowerment, participation in management of the groundwater resources, and then they have to be backed up with appropriate legislation. So it would be very useful to have legislation with teeth to help the people's institutions, by which I mean the Panchayati Raj institutions, the elected municipal corporations, the state governments, and the interested stakeholders, the NGOs, large number of excellent NGOs which are doing good work. Right. They should be involved in this whole, but they should be given adequate powers by a legislative framework. And overall, we need a lot more awareness about this whole issue.
Right, sir. So thank you, sir. So you're talking about legislation being an enabling environment, but really the work being done by communities and other stakeholders on the ground. Absolutely. So the rule of subsidiarity, keep it as close to where the problem is what you're referring to. Wonderful, sir. I think our work shows that as well. So Malini, may I ask you how you translated that on the ground in Maharashtra?
There are two aspects to this whole groundwater. One is legislation, and as Mr. Singh pointed out, the second is institutional arrangements. Now, Maharashtra is one of the few states even today, and it was a pioneering state in having an independent institution for looking at groundwater. This is a groundwater authority of the state. But in the 1970s, when these were set up, it was called the Groundwater Survey and Development Authority, which means enough water was available and you actually developed the means to extract and use the water. And right now, with increasing, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, if you look at the use of groundwater or surface water, you've got urbanization. A state like Maharashtra has 50% urbanization. You have industrialization. You have per capita demands which are increasing. There is conflict between water for industry, water for agriculture, and water for drinking purposes. So all this means that more groundwater has been withdrawn in the last 10 years than in the previous maybe 20 or 30 years. In fact, the increase in the last 4 years estimated by the Groundwater Survey Development Authority in Maharashtra is that it has grown in terms of billion cubic meters from something like 15 billion cubic meters to 17 billion cubic meters, which is about a good amount of increase of a resource which cannot be measured because of uncertainties of measurement, variables in measurement, etc. Having said all this, in 1993, the state of Maharashtra enacted a Groundwater Act. The experience between 1993 and 2003, for instance, was that the act was not very effective because it was tilted more towards the punitive actions. So, based on that, around 2009, the state decided to revise this act and make it include participative issues. So the bill was finally signed in June 2014, and it has aspects of both controlling, punishing, as well as enabling community participation. Punishing the polluters, punishing those who extract too much water, and having participation at every level, the district level, the watershed level, and the state level. It's also taken a pioneering effort in aquifer management. So tracking of aquifers, mapping of aquifers, which was taken on a pilot project under a externally aided project, was appreciated so much by the Government of India that it has recommended it to other states also. But aquifer mapping is a very time consuming exercise, and it requires a lot of parameters to be checked by technical experts. So it's going to take some time. The present Groundwater Act, as it stands, the state has already taken steps to ensure that the participative committees are in place, that the integrated watershed level mapping has to take place. The integrated watershed plan has to be a part of the sub-basin and the basin plan of rivers when the water resources comes up with these plans. So these are all the actions taken. But at the present, it appears that you cannot go around punishing people. For example, the Act says that if you, in the notified areas, if you draw water from below 60 meters, you can actually be punished with jail, imprisonment. Now, that's not the way we can do it at the moment. So there's a huge period. This is an enabling act, and there's a huge provision for creating the awareness, and that's where we need to focus at the moment. Now, when even educated people forget illiterate people, they are not clear about what is groundwater and how much they are taking out. You know, when even building projects, they come up, they say, no, but there is enough rain and it will recharge. So you have to sit down and explain to them, but the rate of recharge is much lower than the rate of discharge, and a simple equation of rate of recharge should be greater than rate of discharge for this entire activity to be sustainable. So that is where a lot of awareness building at various levels, from the top to the bottom, cities, rural areas, farmers, even builders, everybody. So that over a period of time you can, actually this kind of environment awareness existed in the ancient societies. They took responsibility, they owned the project, and they said, we will make this sustainable. So you have to recreate that environment. The law is an enabling provision and it is helpful, but a lot more on the community side.
Needs to be done. So you connect them back to the resource, really. That's what you're saying, connect them back to the resource. Two things I wanted to point out. So when we were studying what Maharashtra's Act has done, we found that for the first time, perhaps you actually defined it as a common pool resource. I think calling it out as a common pool resource. And the second thing that came out was you also called out the finiteness of the resource, in that there is a limit to which you can. So I think we found those two aspects really interesting. And so from a legislation point of view, it was useful to see that that was a leap forward in terms of the nuanced understanding of what legislation can add to the knowledge on the resource. Thank you very much. Dr. Vani, if I may ask you what your thoughts are on the legislative environment, the role of legislation. I know I've seen some of your papers, but if you could articulate, what do you think is perhaps the thing that's needed to actually move legislation as an enabler in this space?
Yeah, and also I support many of your points, and also the question whether legislation can really achieve what you want to achieve in terms of groundwater. And I would say that my own view is that it has only a limited role to play, because if you actually see the history of legislation, the groundwater legislation itself, it has been on the books for such a long time. There have been model bills after model bills, and states have enacted laws, and but the implementation, as you have said, has been quite poor. And even the latest act, as you have said, has seen the need to revise itself, quite dramatically to achieve to respond to the actual conditions on the ground. And I feel ideally what I would like is no groundwater legislation at all. I would rather go back to that situation where we had such sufficient groundwater that you don't need legislation. And that can be achieved by proper management of land and surface water resources, where the groundwater is so abundant that you don't need legislation. But we still may need legislation in terms of achieving equity, for instance, to access to water. So what I rather see is a kind of limited role of legislation, but again the central role of the local communities and local bodies. On another point I would like to emphasize is I am quite unhappy with the very term groundwater legislation. I would like to see it wiped off the books, because I feel that we need to go, as you said again, towards the watershed concept. Why are we continuing to have sectoral legislation, groundwater legislation, and then tank irrigation separately, and then you have canals, separate law for canals, and you have land laws which have got nothing to do with recharge. We have land revenue acts as a main legislation in states, which have got nothing to do with land use zoning, land use management, recharge for groundwater. So I would rather not have separate groundwater legislation at all, but move towards a paradigm where you have only a watershed act. And even a watershed act is not something unprecedented. There are many countries in the world which have watershed acts. US has had it in the 1950s. And South Australia, for instance, has done a very good job of evolving through participatory process a very good watershed law and policy. So I would rather see legislation proceeding in that direction rather than developing a better and better groundwater legislation.
Right. So I think you raise a very important point. So the integration is very important, and there are some who argue that perhaps we should have a natural resources management act of, because and we had a discussion in the morning, and we figured that it's not just about users and users of groundwater which creates conflicts, but there's also the externalities, because energy is a big driver of how groundwater is used. And even if we can manage to sort of license energy in some form, you have solar, which is perhaps also going to if the price of solar falls, then that could actually change the game on groundwater again. So the holistic look of how we then manage all of this perhaps is something that I may want to come back to you and ask you, what is your view then on if indeed they're all so interconnected, and they are, then how do you then vision this whole legislative space? What do you think should be our way to look at this?
I think there's a lot of merit in what my two eminent colleagues have said. We have to involve the communities. There is no go otherwise. But when you have to remember, comparison with countries like Australia with 20 million population, in our country it's hugely complex. The richer farmers would draw all the water, and it's become a huge question of equity, whether the smaller farmer can access water and get enough water for his needs, or is only the richer farmer who goes deeper and deeper and gets all the water. We have to enable the communities. The other part which disturbs me a lot, that wherever there's a large industry, for example, you go to tannery and other, where we as a state have failed to put in place enough mechanisms to ensure that the effluents are properly treated. It's contaminating the groundwater in a very, very complex manner, which is going to be very difficult to take care of it once that contamination, cadmium and all sets into the groundwater. So I think while we encourage, we create awareness, we build the capacity, we provide them support, technical support of skilled manpower, support of NGO groups, I think we'll also need to provide some teeth to the local bodies to take care of the really recalcitrant elements who are otherwise going to play with the lives of people, with havoc to a large number. I mean, look at number of places where we already, the level of contamination has gone beyond any this thing. Yes, you can say the state has failed, but if we have to strengthen the communities, we'll have to provide some strength by a legislative framework.
Wonderful. I think that you really raise a very, very valid point on looking at the specifics of where you might actually get the most value for the legislation, and if you can just focus on that. And to the point of, I think it's more than quantity. Quantity is an issue, but quality is perhaps a bigger problem. Arsenic, fluoride, Arghyam actually has funded 2 networks in fluoride and arsenic, and we find that the geogenic contamination, apart from the other types of contamination, is going to perhaps be a bigger problem going forward. And especially for drinking water security, that indeed, when a lot of India is dependent on groundwater, that it becomes an invisible problem. And I think people are not even aware that because it's odorless, you can't even see it, and you don't know that you're drinking contaminated water. So I think in that respect, the onus is on actually making sure that the safe water is provided from a quality point of view.
I'd like to add one more point. When you look at water quality, which is the next step that we should be looking at, we also find, do we have the capacity to map the all the aquifers in the country in a scientific manner, looking at the contaminants, looking at redressal of that, redemption from the contaminants. This is something we need to also flag as an issue, as a critical issue.
So there's a knowledge gap, and how does that get funded? So I mean, so investments have to follow that as well. So I think some interventions are coming out of our work, but again, scaling that and how does public investment flow into that? Perhaps we could discuss from practice how theory gets built.
Can I just respond to Malini? I think Malini has made a very important point. If you have to involve the communities, they need to be aware what are their resources, how best to share them. So taking a cue from what Maharashtra had done, we've divided the country into we've taken up the most vulnerable parts. Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, one belt, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So these are the most overdrawn areas in the country, most critical areas in the country. I mentioned out of 6,000 odd blocks, 1,063 are overexploited, more than 100%. So most of them lie in this belt. So the government has taken up a project for aquifer mapping of these. So we hope to map the entire water resource, levels, quantities, qualities, flows, how it is being affected, one aquifer to others, different levels of aquifers. We hope to have those results by the end of 2017 for these critical areas and share with the communities with a management plan. Look, this is the amount of water you are sitting over. You decide how best you want to use it, keeping in view the equity and the gender perspective. That is one. You raised an important issue on how can the legislation help. You know, there is a place called Sanchor in Rajasthan. The government of Rajasthan was told you will get only X amount of water, which was the least amount of water. But you shall get that water if you have micro irrigation plans in place, drips and sprinklers in place. The government of Rajasthan has done such a fantastic job with that water, with little amount of water. The result has been for the same amount of water, in Sanchor, Rajasthan uses 0.6 units, same amount of a crop. Gujarat uses 1 unit and Narmada state, Madhya Pradesh, which has so much water from Narmada, it uses 2 units. Now, same way with the groundwater, if you could tell the people, well, you have sitting over a limited resource. One, you make sure that everybody gets the water. The poorest get the water. That's one important point. The tail end farmer gets the water. Two, you will get water, but only so much water. So you decide how you are going to change your cropping intensity. What crops are you still going to use crops which take a large amount of water? How are you using to maximize the leverage for your water available through drip and sprinkler? I think that comes out as a very important resource. If you can set those parameters, Malini rightly said, have aquifer-wise information, management plan, make sure committee knows how much water they have, how do they use it, and then ensure they are able to use it in that manner. They can implement those plans.
I think we've seen that work really successfully in a lot of our pilots as well, and the legislation that helps to provide the umbrella cover, if you will, because you will have to take care of equity, and sometimes that you will have to resort to legislation for that. So very quickly,
if I could just make one point. That is a question of redefinition of property rights in water. Some legislative action is definitely required to shift it from the personal property rights to the common property rights.
So I think that needs to be, it's possible, as we discuss this, that needs to also form part of the...
That's important.
It's very material to this discussion. So context-specific lawmaking is difficult. It takes time, and hence perhaps what we are saying here is that we should look at the possibilities to target prioritized areas, user groups who are most affected, sectors that are most affected, geographies that are most affected. And we're saying that in theory, at least, we should probably start with that, deal with the most vulnerable, and then perhaps we can have a law that unfolds. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure, and hopefully this is one of a series of conversations we'll have on groundwater. Thank you very much.